Hello, hello.
Hey, it's so weird to see you virtually now.
I know, like weird and so normal, almost like I wasn't just in person with you like 48
Right.
hours ago.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It was so much fun to spend quality time in person.
it was awesome. And what a reminder. It served as such a reminder to me of how like this is such a lovely alternative and like one of the like beautiful things that I felt like came out of the pandemic is like
Mm.
connecting with people virtually or like via video has become so normalized and it's not a replacement
No, no.
for in-person
Yeah,
connection.
absolutely. Like I feel like in the, I don't know, 2 days we were together, it feels like uh, we went like so deep to so many
Yeah,
places, so many different corners of our life that I feel like you can do virtually, you can do on the phone, you can do in texting, but that body to body attunement
mm-hmm.
and the vulnerability that it may be different in person than virtually. I definitely I felt it, like this embodiment for sure.
That's cool. Well, and interesting that you say that and vulnerability and all that stuff. This podcast makes me a little brave. Can I ask you some questions about our time together?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And what I've learned about you in person is like you ask all the questions.
I do ask all the questions. Yeah. Yeah. I am realizing that like psychology and like people is like my special interest.
Yes.
It's like the thing I could talk about and like be absorbed in like 24/7 for better and for worse. Um, so there were a couple of times when I was like, can you tell me about whatever? And you visibly looked uncomfortable and like you smiled and you laughed and you
Mhm.
answered, but you did seem uncomfortable. And I want to like check in and see like was I reading that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I would have answered if I didn't want to.
Okay.
Was I uncomfortable? Maybe I was, I don't know if I didn't feel uncomfortable.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe it's just, I think I was more surprised because I
Ah,
guess in my day to day life, people don't go deep. Like,
yeah.
so that I'm like, oh my God, like Colleen is just like the person who just like
Goes there.
does it, right? And it was so funny because it was three of us together. And so, like, I would say, like, two of us were more similar, like, maybe more reserved, right? And so, and yet I think it's like, I guess for me, I think of like reserved doesn't always mean you don't want to share deeply. It's just
Hmm.
that you're less likely to initiate.
I see.
And so, at least my version of reserve, that's
Yeah.
what it was like. I would love to have more deep and meaningful conversations with people, but a lot of people like stay more surface or it takes a lot longer to go deep. And so that's why I like appreciate it. It's like your superpower, like one of your many superpowers is to just like ask the questions. And so
Right.
then like it's actually like it's novel. So that's probably I was just like, oh,
Mm.
we're going there. Like not from like a, ooh, I wish you didn't ask, but more like a
Mm.
I don't have this embodiment. Like I don't have this muscle
I
because it
see.
doesn't tend to happen.
That makes so much sense because you just it was adorable. Like you kept laughing. I would like ask another question. You just
Yeah.
laugh, and I was like, "Is that uncomfortable laughter? Like, what is that?" But that makes sense. It was surprise.
Yeah.
It was
Mhm.
surprise and like getting. It sounds like a getting your bearings. Like, oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Right. Yeah.
here we go.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, okay, cool. I'm always worried about that because like that's literally the only things I ever want to talk about. Um, but I know that's not like normal. Like that's not, most people's like default way of being. So I'm just always I'm like, oh, am I making people uncomfortable? I don't want people to feel like forced to be in like a really like intimate space if they don't want to be. So I'm glad. I'm so glad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was really delightful. And I mean, I guess I recommend like it's like, what are we going to do with this life that we have?
Mhm.
And are we willing to take the risk? Are we willing to invest the time to like build those relationships? Because yeah, I feel like so many people are lonely or feel
Yeah.
alone or don't feel
Yeah.
seen or like are craving, even if they're terrified of like more intimacy. And
Mm-hmm.
like, how are we gonna solve the big problems if we can't like
Right.
have some just like some other conversations that are like deeply meaningful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I totally. It was interesting for me because I'm usually in a group of people, and I guess if we're defining a group by like more than two, um, I'm I'm usually the quiet one.
Mm,
Like once I'm talking with an individual, usually in a group, there's no hold barred. Like then I'm not reserved in that way. I'm all I want to do is like go deep and like
mm,
yeah, it does it. It's funny even to hear it like characterized as a superpower because I'm like, I just don't know any other way of being. And I'm like, I'm
mm,
learning why that might be.
mm,
But yeah, so it felt really unusual for me to be the one being like initiating conversation
mm.
and taking on that role. I think that's part of why I wanted to check in because I'm like, this feels so
Right,
foreign to me.
right.
Yeah, because I usually am surrounded by extroverts.
Mm, right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And you were surrounded by introverts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so
Yeah.
true. And I think it like juxtaposes with, you know, I'm in this period where I'm like examining so many different relationships in my life. Like people I've been in relationship for either all of my life or like my adult life at least. And so, you know, there are other relationships I have which aren't as easy, right? Or,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, it's hard to build the intimacy, or I feel like I'm the driver
Yeah.
and without me driving it, it doesn't go far. And so, I think I mentioned like I'm planning this, organizing this family reunion that's happening this
Yeah.
coming weekend, and like all the stuff that gets stirred up. Like for the
Mhm.
most part, I'm like having lots of joy, but there's also like being awake to like I have a distant relationship with my sibling. I have a distant relationship with my father. I have great affection for them. They have affection for me. It's just our ways of being in the world to make it difficult for us to have like this kind of intimacy that we're
Yeah.
talking about. And it's just like, when we get together, we don't have the capacity to do that. Probably lots of intergenerational trauma and cultural stuff and or like that's not our love language, or that's not the way that we like show up for
Totally.
each
That's
other,
just
right?
not the way you guys connect.
Yeah. And so it's like, how can I be, I think what I'm learning kind of in therapy, which is also, part of what I said, I like went in there was to like noticing the ways that I was armoring or guarding myself and like wanting to give myself permission
Mhm.
that it's okay to be um, more present in my relationships, to be seen more. And it's been really, when we talk about liberation or freedom, it's been so interesting to see like recurring patterns, and highly recommend it for people who want to get to know like what are their relational patterns and how do they come to be and what's reinforcing, and some of it is painful. Like I can see why people don't go to those places, because it's kind of painful to think about harm that we may have caused or that people may have caused to us that makes us armor up
Yeah.
and
Right.
spend more time on our devices rather than with people.
That's right. And I think about how often we may not even realize that we're armored up, certainly like in the situation, but for me at least, like without intentional reflection after, I'm like, ooh, I noticed that I was like acting weird or I felt weird or like something, whatever, without being able to stop and pause and reflect on that. Only then can I be like, oh, I felt weird and I felt ashamed or I felt uncomfortable or I felt like worried about rejection. So when it was showing up in this weird way, but like I didn't know that's what was going on in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Full disclosure, when we were getting in the car together and I felt so discombobulated. I was driving my husband's car. I couldn't get navigation up. I really struggle with like directions and navigation. And then when tech is a piece of that, it's like I get so overwhelmed. I was so overwhelmed, but I felt so silly for being overwhelmed that I just felt like a bubbling kind of idiot. I was like, just like laughing and like trying to plug things in and being like, oh, forget it. Oh, no, I need to know. And I felt so uncomfortable. Like, and I felt overwhelmed, but I almost didn't even realize I felt overwhelmed.
Mm.
I was like covering it up with all this stuff. And that was me armoring because you're like new to my in-person life.
Right.
And it
Right.
wasn't until afterwards where I was like, oh, I felt really overwhelmed and then ashamed about being overwhelmed,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah. And it was interesting because I was like, should I read the directions for her? Like, I don't want to like if she knows where she's going, I don't want to be like the person like savior mode, rescue mode. But I want to help, but I'm not sure. Right. Like, so it's
Yeah,
so interesting, right? Yeah.
that's right. And like, this is the beauty of like this whole process of like resting and awakening, right? Is the more I learn about myself, the more I can accept myself, the more I'm getting better at like having less of those moments where I can just say, I'm super fucking overwhelmed right now, right?
Mm. Right. Yeah.
It didn't happen in that moment, but there are other places in my life where
Right.
I've noticed I have been able to just like totally unmask and just say the thing with varying levels of like discomfort or shame,
Right.
you know,
Right.
but there's so much power and beauty in like just getting to be exactly who we are. But again, we can't do that without stopping, being
Right.
aware, stopping, reflecting,
Right.
doing whatever we need to do to grow the muscle, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think something I'm thinking about in terms of just deepening relationships is I feel like I'm really intentional about like which white friends I cultivate,
Yeah.
right? And partly is because I don't have the capacity or the energy to like spend a lot of meaningful time with people who aren't on the anti-racism journey, right? Um, like meaning like it's an active like value that they have in their life. And so that allows me to mask less, right? Is that, you know, my white appeasing self doesn't need to show up as
Yes.
much. And so I can censor less and I can show up more authentically. And so like
Yeah.
I don't take that for granted because I think that there are a lot of really nice white people out there who aren't aware of who they are as racial beings or how that might play out in our relationship or in our dynamics or in just the world. So if we're talking about a topic, like having race be a part of like the the calibration is really important to me. So,
Yeah.
you know, I think we've made that part of the podcast, but like I think in general, like I think that's important. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, uh, there's a group of other racially minoritized people that like we meet to chat, and we've been talking a lot about our white appeasing selves and how that shows up in predominantly white spaces. And it's amazing how it's such a thing. Like we talk about code switching, or we talk about like how spaces become white, or how people assimilate, or like that awkward moment where I say something like that names whiteness, and I'm just met with blank stares. And
Yes.
the blank stares could be so many different things. It could be like,
Yes.
I can't believe she said that. It could be like, I don't know what to say to that.
Right.
Or it could be like, I'm like frozen or going into fawn
Right.
mode. Like I agree with her, but I don't have the fluency to say it out loud yet. Right. Like, so like all
Yeah.
those things, which makes it like, then, right. Then it becomes like, oh, do I armor up? Like maybe I went too far, or like,
Right.
ooh, like you left me hanging, or like all the
Right.
stuff. Like, how do we encourage each other to like not mask,
To
right?
not
To like,
mask.
right? Which
Yes.
is a different version of code switching, right?
Totally. Yes. God, I feel that so deeply. And it makes me think about how I have created a life only partially conscious that's almost exclusively women. And it's only recently that I've started being more open to being with men because I feel like I have a sturdiness that I didn't have inside me before, to appease less, or just like say what I need to say, right? And clearly, like, gender and race are not the same, but I feel like I have a taste of the understanding of what you're talking about as a white woman. So
And I'm gonna add that I think it was like a mixture of like being in a neuroqueer space,
yes, yes,
right? Like,
yes,
so
yes,
it
yes, yes.
wasn't like, so I think like that intersectionality, like I think the fact that we were all queer, like helped also because we're already used to transgressing or like
Yes.
challenging things, right? And then I think, 2 out of 3 of us identifying as neurodivergent, right? Like also like that adding a dimension to it. So I feel like all of that makes, at least for me, the space more accessible.
Good. I mean, I'm so glad. And I do want to ask, like, about the race piece specifically. I guess how did it feel to be with two white women the entire weekend? Was there
Um,
that element of like white appeasing that like reared its head?
no, I don't think so.
No,
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because like been doing so much of my life that sometimes it's hard to know like
notice.
what's me and what is it, but I don't feel there was anything to censor.
Okay.
Yeah, like I just didn't you know, yeah, there was nothing. Yeah, there was ease.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah, because like dinners and spas sound nice and relaxing, but if you're still feeling like you need to
Mm,
like hide or censor or filter parts of yourself,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm,
It was really good, and it was really interesting for me to see, because we're newer friends, right?
right. Yeah.
And I don't have many new adult friends. I have lots of like little groups or like one-on-one relationships, but they're friendships that I've carried with me for a long time at this point. It takes a lot for me to be like, I want to make a new friend. Like there's
Mm,
always all this like armor that immediately comes up. Oh, I feel emotional even thinking about it, where I'm like, oh God, it feels like such a commitment, right? And so it was interesting, and glorious and lovely,
mm,
to be in person with a newer friend. And it's
mm,
like, where are the parts that I feel comfortable, and where was that one part where I was like, oh my
mm,
God, I feel like a weirdo,
mm,
and realized in retrospect I was like hiding my weirdness.
mm.
So yeah, really, really interesting.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's so interesting how it all converges, right? So it's like all the stuff I'm exploring in therapy, like all the stuff like we're talking about. And so thinking about like how this armoring plays so much a part. So like before I got on the plane on last Wednesday, I was like in a staff meeting that I was running, and it there was some energy I had that day. And maybe this is a matter of like I've been here for 11 months. And so there's a level of like I can let the armor come down a little bit more. And so I felt like I was like maybe like one of the most authentic versions of myself in that staff meeting.
Mm,
Like the joking part of me and the silly part of me and so like it's so interesting just to then see you all, right? And so um and and just to think about like I love my armor, like it's been a good friend for like majority of my life.
oh, that's such a beautiful
um
way to think about that.
and it's gotten me through some hard times. It's
Yeah,
helped me survive my family of origin in many ways. And it's nice to have places where I can let it go.
yeah.
Yeah. And to see like little ways at which it's naturally happening and I don't have to think consciously. Can you share a little bit more? Can you go a little
Right,
deeper? Because there's so much in my life that hasn't been asked of me.
right.
So
That is such a beautiful and nuanced way to think about that, because I even think in like the psych community, we pathologize or it's easy, some of us are in moments to pathologize like defensiveness, right? Or defenses, which
Mhm.
is armor, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but to honor all the ways that it serves us, not just in the past, but like we need it. We can't
Mhm.
walk around unarmored. I think this is part of my struggle in life. I would like in many ways love to walk around unarmored because it does feel like a heavy, it feels heavy a lot. But that's not the world we live in right now. And so the how necessary it is to have spaces where it just comes off without even thinking about it, right? Like
Mhm.
and it's not this like conscious decision we have to make, which, whatever is also labor. But then also to think about how can I be more intentional about when I have some armor on and when I don't, and to what degree, right? Again, it's
Mhm.
not all or nothing, and
Right.
it can be nuanced, and it is not just necessary, but helpful at times,
Mhm.
and can be really it serve us in good ways, yeah, I really appreciate that perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember a couple years ago reading it was a Black person, I don't remember her name, who wrote like there are many books out there about Enneagrams. And
Yeah.
she wrote like basically the a Black centered version. And she talked about armor, like our different Enneagram styles as like different armoring, which I had never heard it said in that way. And it has stayed with me about just thinking about all the different ways we have of surviving,
Hmm.
like thinking of it as armor, right? Like some of us
Hmm.
intellectualize, right? And some of us like are more reserved or, are more perfectionistic, right? All of these are examples of armoring that we wouldn't even perhaps think about as armored, right? It's just like something we value or something we do or just our personality. But like maybe it's more than just that.
Yeah. Right. It's all the different ways that we survive and navigate and then hopefully thrive in the world.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it is cool to think about like it is part of how we thrive, right?
Mhm.
Because if we did not armor up in some capacity with people or in spaces or in places that like can do us harm, well, that doesn't serve anyone.
Mhm.
Um, it's again coming back, it feels like to how aware are we of
Yeah.
what's happening and why, and is it serving or not, and to what
Mhm.
degree, right?
Yeah. And I
Um,
think about how much, at work, it's such a challenge to try to challenge white supremacy culture or colonialism or like this idea of can we be more vulnerable
yeah,
at work, right? And I feel like that's been a recurring theme over the last year, right? Is like this notion of armoring up at work
yeah,
that so many people have, right? Is like I don't bring my personal side, I don't talk about this other stuff, and yet especially in the mental health field, like so much of that other stuff is impacting like who we are as clinicians, who we are
yeah.
as leaders, and who we are as colleagues to each other. And so to like, what's that conditioning that says I should keep it separate?
Hmm.
It's a different thing if like you value it being separate and you're choosing that for yourself
Right.
versus the
I
the
have.
rules that say that I can't bring
That's
that
right.
part of myself. And there's something wrong with me if I choose to do that.
That's right. That's the entire reason, not the entire, but like maybe 90% of the reason I started CCBH. Like I felt like I had to show up this shell of who I was everywhere. And that anytime I was like my full, passionate, loud, excitable, tearful, whatever self, that it was like, whoa, I needed a place where I got to be like the fullness of who I am and like wanted other people to feel that too. And then what a learning that has been about like that is beautiful in theory. And
Right.
the execution of that with a diverse group of people is like
Mhm.
really fucking tricky. Um,
Yeah.
and like how do you do that in a way that makes people feel safe. And how do you make sure that, right, like that people know it's not like you have to show up and cry and be emotional. It's like, no,
Right.
it's like freedom. And then the emotional hangovers, once somebody does show up more, it's navigating all of that.
Right.
Yeah, what a journey.
Mhm.
And just learning it has been it because it's so good in theory, but like and in practice, but in practice, it requires practice and
Yeah,
discussion and
absolutely.
humility and oof,
Mhm. And I think the thing I've been wrestling with is like partly vulnerability, but also partly, when we try to share power and yield control as like I think leaders, is that some people are so socialized for it to be top down
yeah.
that it's hard for them to pick up their side of things, right? To
Woo,
communicate what
yes.
they need or what they don't like, or a simple thing like, should we have a training on this? Like what do you want to learn about? Like whatever the thing is, right? It's like the not taking like power and then like perhaps like critiquing that it wasn't satisfactory, right? And yet it's like, but
Oh,
yet,
that is some truth telling right there.
right?
Oh my
But
God.
could you name it for yourself? Right? It's kind of like we get so seduced into, well, the boss is going to take care of it versus like I'm co-creating this, right? And if this is not like, a good use of my time, like what's my role in that? Right? Like what could I do to like, take some of the power back in order to make it what I want it to be?
My mind is blown. I I had yes, I all of that. I had just never seen it through the lens of people having no lived experience sharing power, because for most of us, we've always existed in hierarchical systems. And again, all the practice it requires.
Mhm. It does. Yeah. And I think what
Oh,
I'm loving, at least this season, this version of me, and I'm hoping that I can keep the momentum going, is I feel like I've been doing so much truth telling the last couple of weeks. And not in a violent, aggressive,
right.
dehumanizing kind of way, but more in a like, I feel like I've always been a direct person, but I usually, because I'm armored, right? So like I will be transparent but not vulnerable. So like I might say like, oh,
Mm,
I didn't like that, or I wish you didn't do that, but I wouldn't like go deeper to say like
it really hurt me.
whatever,
Mm.
right? And so I might say ouch, but I wouldn't say like how it was ouch, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking
Mhm.
about like it's like rolling off the tongue now, or it's rolling in my texts now. And it's making me feel great. Like it doesn't feel great to say the things because those are hard things, but it feels liberating in a I am teaching these people in my life how I need them to adjust,
That's
or
right.
how I need them to know that they have an impact on me and I believe they could do better. Um, and not in a also condescending way, but like it's like, how can we possibly recalibrate our relationships if we don't let people know how
Yes.
they're not showing up, right? Because I'm so good at saying like, ouch, or whatever, or I don't like it, and then putting distance in our relationship rather than giving you the chance to perhaps be able to meet me where I'm at.
All of that. And I wonder if this is part of how it shows up for you. But what I've realized is like when it seems like someone isn't acknowledging some reality, let's just call it like reality, whatever it just is, no judgment, it's just like whatever it just is. And when it feels like people are ignoring that, I'm willing to ignore it, because just pointing it out like, oh, this thing over here is happening, there's a sense it's going to like make them uncomfortable or upset them or whatever. So it's like I'm willing to stay with that, whatever the narrative over here, without acknowledging this over here. And so for me, it's just been like, we don't have to say what's right or wrong, or we don't have to direct or say, you have to do this or you can't do that. But like, it's okay to just say there's this thing happening over here that I see. And maybe your perspective is different on it, but can we at least talk about this thing happening
Right.
over here?
Right.
And I've grown so accustomed to just like not even naming it, in service of like, just keep things moving, like don't make ripple, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
That it doesn't have to be like all angry and like blowing something up or burning it down. It's like, can we just level set about what is real for each of us? Because
Right.
this is what I see as real.
Right.
Do you not see it, or do you just not want to talk about like what's happening?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And something I've been thinking a lot about the last couple of weeks in like all these conversations I'm in with people is I think this concept of gaslighting, I think a lot of people do it,
Yes.
but not always intentionally.
Right. Not in a malicious way.
Yeah, in a like, I am so unaware or I am
Yes.
so armored or defended
Yes.
that I don't even realize that I am saying something that like denies my reality that actually happened, right? Like it's kind of like, why can't you just own you did the thing or own that you changed your mind, right? Versus like making it appear as though like I'm the one in question, but
Right.
like, but I have like the receipts, right? Like I have the messages or I have the like
Right.
whatever it is. And so I think this concept of like that's the harm that can happen at like little levels and huge levels is when we are asleep or we're so armored or so defended that we can't own that we did the thing or
That's
we
right.
said the thing.
That's 100%. I've been saying for weeks now that we need a new word in our lexicon that describes gaslighting without all the like undertones of like undertones of like abuse and narcissism and like trying to do harm and all this like poor intent. It's like, and whether it's asleep, and as you know, I am on this like deep dive learning about neurodivergence, and I'm now realizing that with some neurodivergent people, like alexithymia is a thing where like it's often associated with neurodivergence. It's not a symptom, but like you just don't, it's really hard to know what you're feeling. Like you just, because of sensory or language processing, it's just really, really hard to have access and give language to what you're feeling. And there's like interoception, where again, associated with neurodivergence, where like it's really hard for some neurodivergent people to take signals from their body to know when they're hungry, they're thirsty, they're overwhelmed, whatever. And like between those two things, I think that's accounted for so many of the experiences I've had in my family where I feel gaslit. And again, like not understanding and like all the feelings that come with being gaslit, but also offering benefit of the doubt, where it's like, I know you love me and you wouldn't try to make me feel crazy. So what the fuck is going on?
Right. Yeah.
So all that to say, I'm with you. And I think there's so many reasons why we deny our own reality or other people's reality. And I think the majority of it is benign.
Yeah. And boy, does that take effort, right? To internally be able to say that perhaps it is whatever I'm interpreting it to be. Like I might be observing that this is happening, but I don't have to interpret it as this or that.
That's right. That's right. And oh my God, like again, when we give ourselves that room where we can still say, like, just because there's no malintent here doesn't mean I don't get to feel upset about
Right. Yeah.
what you just said that denied my reality.
Right.
But like when we can take it not personally for a minute, oh, it just gives us a window to get curious and engage in a dialogue that could be ultimately quite helpful, especially when it's with someone who we like love and trust.
Right.
But like again, but culture and all the messages that we've been given about gaslighting, when some of it really is abusive, regardless of intent, and some of it is abusive and is meant to be abused, like again, it's growing that muscle of sturdiness inside of ourselves to be like,
Right.
can I pause
Right.
to just give myself or us a minute to figure out what the fuck just happened? Because it didn't feel good.
Right.
It doesn't mean it was bad,
Mhm.
or all bad, or there's not
Right.
something here to learn, you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And this other things we're just talking about, like relationships, is I think what became clear to me over the weekend when I was talking to a family member was, I often hear, particularly in the therapy room, we're like, what's the point of saying like things to people, like how I'm feeling or how this landed with
Mm,
me, if the person isn't going to change,
mm,
right? And it's like, yes, I could totally see that, right? Like you have to decide for yourself, do I want to put the emotional
right.
labor in, right? Is it worth the risk?
Yep.
And I had this experience over the weekend of like I had been harboring uh, feelings like resentment, rage, towards this family member. And I felt like I couldn't express it because the person had said, I can't talk about this. And so we didn't talk about it for months. And it was living in my body. It was like a
Mhm.
vibe, right? And so there was emotional distance because
Yeah.
the air hadn't been
Cleared?
cleared. And so I was able to like reach out to the person over the weekend and I was able to clear the air. And even though they still didn't understand my perspective or couldn't meet me halfway, I felt ease. Like, there's still like sadness or
Yeah.
disappointment, but that's so little compared
Yeah.
to like, I could then let go of what I had been holding because I
Yeah.
felt like I had cleared the air. And I get that. Like for me, that's my way of processing. If I can clear the air, I can move on and I can accept you for who you are in the season of your life. But if I can't clear the air, then that's when it's hard for me to like bridge the gap of the distance. And I get that for this person, it actually made things worse for them because
Yeah.
for them they felt flooded and overwhelmed. Right. And so like just like how do we be in these relationships where for one person sharing out loud
Yep.
brings them peace and the other person it overwhelms their nervous system, and like how do we do that dance to like
Yes.
recalibrate?
Totally. Totally. Yeah. As you know, I'm doing so much like, plant-based medicine work, and like so much of that work is about just letting energy move through. And that, so for so many of us, we feel energy, which is what, emotion, activation, whatever. And we immediately go up here. Like we cannot tolerate it in here. So it's immediately up here, right? We start to tell stories about it. We increase our
Mhm.
suffering and all these things, right? So I love that for you, right? That like you just let it move through. You just said what needed to be said, right? And like, and I'm sure that you did it with truth, but also kindness, but also not policing yourself, right? Like that there's,
Mhm.
it's so nuanced because this doesn't just give us permission to be assholes to people.
Right.
Um, but like if we can work to let it move through in a way that honors the truth of what is happening inside of us,
Mhm.
it just creates so much space.
Mhm.
Yeah, but we don't, we like get it stuck in our heads and then it just stays stuck in our bodies. And
Right.
this is the human experience, right? We're all figuring
Right. Yeah,
hopefully a way
absolutely.
to
And
make
that it may not have a happy ending, right?
it
Or it may
right.
not have like that resolution or transformation immediately, right? Like, and I
Right.
think that's the risk, right? Is that if we put the thing out there, we can't take it back, right? And yet I feel like for my own liberation and for relationships to get healthier, is that I need to like reveal more of myself. That's
Yes.
the only way that we have a chance at saving this relationship or letting this relationship evolve to the next iteration.
Yes. Right. And it's so scary to do that.
For sure.
It's so scary to do that because again, it's like it's the walking off the cliff or the invisible staircase, right? It's just
Right.
like, there has to be, that's for me why all of this work, collective liberation, anti-racism, like it is so deeply tied to spirituality for me because like there's no way that I could ever be brave enough to do, any of these things, right? If there wasn't some, ooh, like deep faith or belief that it's all going to be okay, in whatever that, which does not mean it's going to work out the way that I want it to, or the way that I like it to, or
Absolutely. Yeah.
whatever, but like some deep faith that like it's going to ultimately be even better
Right.
than my human mind could ever force it to be, or like figure out
Right.
intellectually,
Right.
I don't know how people do this without something
Same.
something
Like,
helping them.
yeah, I feel like I need to be rooted in some way, right? And even if that thing is not something I can see or even feel or even touch, but to know that um, that I'm not alone, no matter what the inner voice might be saying moment to moment.
Yeah, totally. And I want to be clear for any people listening that like it doesn't have to, for me, that when I say I need something outside of me, or like help, I need help, that like doesn't have to be God. That can be like the energy from the earth, that that can be the beauty of the night sky. It can be, again, it can look, religion has like bastardized this a little bit, I think, for people, but like I just want to be over communicate that it can look so many different ways, where you get those internal resources that you need to be brave and say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oof,
Mm.
what a
This
journey.
is good. This is good stuff. Yeah, I'm like, I was mentioning to you before we started about how I'm like writing a speech to give like a keynote address tomorrow on the meaning of Juneteenth, which is outside of my comfort zone because I don't tend to give speeches. I run lots of trainings and workshops, but not speeches. And part of my internal processing is, do I bring my white appeasing self to the speech, or do I bring my more authentic racial self to the speech? And is there a way to do both? Or, like feeling into like what's the vibe of the space?
Yeah.
And because I think that we as a culture, particularly the United States, though I don't think it's unique to the United States, like to package things, like talk about hard things. Like, when I think of Juneteenth, right? Like the not even the abolishment of slavery, right? It's like the 2 years later after the abolishment of slavery, when the people in Texas who were enslaved figured out they were free. Um, like that's like a packed with lots of stuff, right?
That's juicy.
Yeah, and so like we can like package it up into like a pretty little package, just like we do with like Thanksgiving or Fourth of July. But all of these are surrounded by violence and oppression, and it's like, how do we hold that?
Yeah.
Um, Especially if we're not used to having these conversations about like, lots of harm has happened and debts haven't been paid, and reparations need to happen.
Right. That's, yeah, totally. And just the further I go on this journey, it is that realization of like, it can be so nuanced. It probably ought to be so nuanced, right? Because when we default to like, it's all or nothing, or it's this or that, or it's one or the other, like that is likely coming from a place of activation. That for me, that typically means I'm in a stress response, right? And I'm trying to like make a decision now so I can be done with it. So it stops taking up so much like space in my brain and my body, right? So I'm thrilled for you that like you're using this process like you do everything else, right? To just sit with it and discern and like give you the time that you need to figure out and feel into things and play and experiment with different iterations. Like, man, if we all gave ourselves the time and the permission to just like take our time with things, and we can survive the discomfort. Oh, yeah, I'm sure it's gonna be amazing.
Yeah, thanks. I'll let you know how it goes. I'll let you know
Yeah.
which version of myself ends up showing up.
I'll be so curious, right? In all the different ways, like I imagine in some places you'll want to give yourself permission to be exactly who you are. And in other places, maybe it makes sense to do something a little more kid glove, so I'll be
Right.
so
Yeah.
curious. Maybe we could even talk about your process a little bit and what you decided. Yeah,
Great.
cool.
Well, I feel nourished by this conversation.
Same, same. So affirming of it's just the journey toward liberation is complicated and nuanced and it's supposed to be, right? Like
Yeah,
that means,
absolutely.
yeah, that means it's going well.
Yeah. Awesome. All
Good.
right.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. And only a couple more left.
Yeah, we're gonna be wrapping up the podcast. I think we have 2 more episodes after this one. So yeah,
It'll be
stay
interesting.
tuned.
Yeah,
Yeah,
how we close it out.
yeah, absolutely. Take
All
care,
right.
everyone.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.